Hey, hi, Linda. I am so excited. I'm really thrilled that you agreed to be here. When I reached out to you, I had just read the interview with Kaleidoscope Society,
Mm.
and I am not exaggerating when I say it made me cry.
Oh.
Uh, I really teared up, and it was really emotional, and I just felt so moved
Mm.
by your story. I love your comic also gets me kind of teary-eyed sometimes. I
Oh.
gotta say, I think it's just so beautiful and so from the heart. And I really just, I wanted to make sure I said this before we even got started, because I was like, I just want to thank you for what you're doing, for
Oh.
your perspective. It's just an incredible thing for this community. Yeah. So, and I wanted to make sure I didn't forget to say that. So,
Thank you.
anyway, I just want to get started. I guess I'll start asking about your diagnosis. It was about 5 years
Yeah.
ago, right? And what was going on in your life that really led to you kind of putting the dots together? Because it sounds like it was a combined diagnosis with a lot of other
Hmm.
stuff too, right? So what was
Yeah.
happening in your 25-year-old life?
So, the so I sort of had a quarter life crisis, I guess you would call it. So I had basically left like my fourth job since getting out of college, and I was living back at home trying to figure out what my next steps were. So I think uh, I'm already on a tangent, but I don't know if you've ever seen like Everything Everywhere All at Once. Um, but like if you haven't, it's this recent sort of like kind of mind bending sci-fi like action martial arts thing. But the main character is basically this like middle-aged woman who is like being audited because she has just gone through like, 30, 50 businesses, and she's just been hopping from like one idea to the other. And that was like definitely me. But I guess like early on in my life. So I think like the diagnosis came actually like after a culmination of basically an entire lifetime of kind of feeling like I was living somewhat like an imposter, right? So like I think growing up I was always told I was bright and I tried really hard at school and I loved school, but at the same time it's like I always struggled with racing thoughts, too fast mind, and then there were things that I would definitely just like shy away from because like I felt like I couldn't master them. And so I think like I basically went through both school, university years, and early career, seeing my brain as the enemy as something like I really had to, work like a workhorse 3 times as hard as it felt everyone else was working to get to where I wanted to be. So I would swing between like, being really put together, or at least I tried to seem very put together, like on the outside, and then just having these like long, like lulls where I would just crash. So yeah, by the time I was 25, I'd already gone through like 4 jobs, and it felt like every time a chapter closed, like I had to start from tabla rasa. And, that might not have been true, but it definitely like that's what it felt like. And so really like the thing that prompted the diagnosis was actually one day I was at the local bookstore and there was, like a clearance bin, and I love books. Like libraries and bookstores have always been sort of like a refuge for me. And I realize it's like, because it's like a very tidy, structured environment with like all of the things I love. And yeah, and there was like a book in the clearance bin that I picked up, honestly, because the cover was like green and purple, and those are my favorite colors. But it was this book called Fast Minds, like How to Thrive If You Think You Have ADHD. And I was like flipping through it. And there were some like early like self-assessments in the beginning, and I was like, oh, like what? So I ended up buying it for like $4.99 or something. And yeah, and I just spent like that whole day just like reading it. And honestly, I didn't complete all the self-assessments. I probably did like the first like 4. And then I was like, I think this is me. And that's kind of like what prompted finally picking up a phone, or I guess like I might have made an online booking to get a meeting with a psychiatrist.
There's so much in the title of a book, right? I feel like
Yeah.
when I was first, it was like when it was first suggested to me by my therapist that I start to look into ADHD, and I started connecting the dots a little bit, and then and then it's like, oh my goodness, then you go into that hyper research mode. And I remember finding that book, You Mean I'm Not Crazy, Lazy, or Stupid, and being like, I'm in the right place.
Yes, absolutely.
So even just the title, Fast Minds, you're like, yeah.
And I think like it also, because like I'd known about ADHD before, but I think like a lot of us, like I was never physically hyper as a child, so like that was just like not something that clicked with me. But I think like just Fast Minds, I was like, yeah, like that's the hyperactivity that I identify with, like not so much the physically impulsive side, but more, like can't control my thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think a reason why many of us don't even think that is part of ADHD is because it didn't occur to me that wasn't how everybody thought, right? And so, like, I remember going when I went for my diagnosis and was talking to my doctor, and she was asking me if I lose things, because it's like one of the questions on the DSM, and I was like, no, I don't lose things. I'm actually, and I went into this whole long diatribe about the systems I had around how I don't lose things. And I was like, I have a set of glasses in every car, and I have a set of glasses next to the TV, and then I have one upstairs. And she was like, you work really hard to not lose things. And that was the first time it had ever occurred to me how hard I was working, and realizing, but again, like realizing like, oh, that's not what everybody does. And I think that's probably a lot of the reason why so many of us don't relate to the hyperactivity element. Even if you say the term internalized hyperactivity, I would still think that that racing mind is just how everybody thinks, right? I just assumed that was everybody.
Exactly.
Wow. I think, you had mentioned in, I guess, I'm not sure if it was the interview with Kaleidoscope Society or not, but you had talked about, doing really well and doing well in school. And, I feel like the vast majority of the women I interview had a similar experience, right? Which was like, not having that stereotypical, view that we have of the student, but actually doing really, really well. And then how you had felt like you had convinced everybody, that you had fooled everybody into thinking that you were competent. And that speaks to, I think, a real element of neurodivergence that is so hard to articulate, right? That idea that like, that people see me as being this incredibly competent or together. I'm not sure what the word is, but like that, I'm losing my train of thought.
I totally feel you.
I think it's that idea that like, we, I'm gonna have to move on because I'm sorry, I've lost it.
No, that's totally fine. Just like, but sort of like what you were thinking about, like reminded me of like learning about the term masking, and like that, like I just didn't realize that that's what I've been doing. I feel like something that I really remember, like even early on in kindergarten, all the way up until undergrad, like I would see people that like I really admired, right? And so I guess like in undergrad, I remember just going to this seminar, my seminars, and there was this one girl who was in a lot of my classes, and she always like looked so put together, she would like come to class, and it's not even like, she was like dressed super well, like she was in like, Uggs and whatever, but like, she always had like her coffee and then her computer, and it was super clean, and then she had like really organized notes, and she would like sit really straight and type, and I was like, I want to be like that. And so I would like try really hard to like do that, and it would work for like a couple of classes, and then things would kind of just like fall apart. But like I would always sort of like aspire to, I think, and I think like that's also one of the reasons like so many of us kind of fly under the radar, because it's like, when we put our minds to something, like we can hyper focus and try to achieve like that level of either like normalcy or like, goals, #goals. But it's like, I guess like I just never realized that, like maybe it wasn't because I was deficient and couldn't be like that. It's just that like maybe we function differently, and like what, like how she, well, who knows? Like I'm not in her mind, right? But like but yeah, but I think like there's just that internal like monologue of like, why does it seem so easy for other people, and why is it so hard for me? And then like I think for a lot of us that very easily becomes like, it's because like you're not good enough, or you're not trying hard enough, or you're just like a lazy person. So
yeah, and I think one thing that can be so difficult, and I think a lot of your comics talk to this the desire to do well, like the desire to please is so strong, and yet it's so often interpreted as the opposite, right? And so it's like, how do you build your self-concept into adulthood out of this back and forth between like I'm trying really, really hard at something, and it's being seen or perceived as me not trying, as me being lazy or disorganized or not having discipline or all of those things. Like, exactly. Right. And then being like, how, if this is like how my personality has been built on this like messaging in my life, no wonder I have a lot to unpack in adulthood. And I think, one of the things you had mentioned about that it's been difficult to talk openly about mental health since your diagnosis. Was that so? I'm curious. Was that part of why you started the Panda Cub comics, or what was the inspiration for Panda Cub?
Yeah, so that was definitely part of the inspiration. Although for me, often like I start something and I don't know why I'm doing it until like a while later, and I look back, I'm like, oh. So I think in particular, I guess like there were two ways where it was difficult to talk about it. And in one way, it's like it was difficult for me to like gather my thoughts and like explain it in a way that wasn't like, because you know how we tell stories, like we start from A and then we're like, and then we go here and they're like, but like 8 years ago, this, and then you make all of these like loops, and then by the time you're at the end of your explanation, everyone listening is like, what? And then like, and you're also like, wait, what was I saying? So I think like on one hand, the comics were for me the best creative container for me to both sort of like indulge my like asides and like like flights of fancy, but also in the process of editing the comic and editing the story, it's sort of like I both am able to crystallize the things that I actually want to say into something that I'm like, oh, right, like that is like truly like what I meant to say. And then the benefit is also like that becomes a way of telling my story to other people in a way that is easier for them to understand as well. And I'm a big nerd, like when it comes to word text interaction and storytelling, like with pictures and text, because my background is in children's literature and education. And so I think like on one hand, that is what made talking about this topic more easy. And then on the other hand, it has to do with kind of like my background. So I'm Chinese-American, and I would say like at risk of generalizing, but like most Asian society, like communities, mental health is still quite stigmatized. And so like growing up, anything related to mental illness or like, I don't even think like mental health was really necessarily a concept. But, if you called someone like, oh, like 神经病, which is the actual medical term for like someone with like, neurodivergency, that is actually like seen as an insult, and a very like severe insult. So I think like once I was fighting with my mom and I was like, oh, like, why are you so crazy? But in Chinese. And of course, like saying that to someone in English is also not nice. But I think like I just didn't realize kind of how heavy that was in my home language. And she was very upset. My dad was very upset. He was like, you never say that to someone. And so I think like creating these comics, because like my comics are also bilingual. And I use them partially also as a way for me to practice like expressing myself in Chinese. Those have actually become a bridge for me to start like talking to like my mom mostly, but also like my broader family about these issues. And it's sort of like served as kind of almost like a doorway. And I remember I'd like published one of my comics, and she had like messaged me on our family chat platform. And she was like, oh, I like never realized you felt this way. I think I probably struggled with like Youyujin or depression as well. And so like, and then we started talking about something that we just never talked about before. So I think for me, that was also quite, I think, surprising. And like my last tangent is, I don't know if you've been following the news, but like there's this US comedy video troupe called the Try Guys that have been in the news because yeah. So putting aside that, I've been a longtime fan of the Try Guys, and my favorite Try Guy is Eugene, and he's the Korean-American, and one of his like big things is he came out as gay a couple of years ago with this like really beautifully like lushly filmed coming out like music video, and they went on tour, and basically he was like, I've done all of this, and it's so much easier for me to share this part of me with like millions of fans, but I've actually never sat down and talked to my family about being gay. Like they were like, he's like, I came out to them when I was 18, and then we just never had that conversation again. And so like for him, I was watching their documentary, and yeah, his mom and stepfather came to see his performance, and that was like the first time really that conversation happened. So I feel like for me, it's like a smaller scale version of that. And yeah. And sometimes I'm like, Linda, why can't you just be like normal and have a conversation with your parents? But I think I've become, a little bit more compassionate towards myself as well. And it's like, yeah, like sometimes, there isn't a textbook perfect way of approaching things. And if things work for you, then they work for you.
Yeah, that's actually the part that made me cry. Was the story about your mom reaching out to you after you had posted that comment. I think there's so much there in terms of often like it's hard to even express how difficult it can be to talk about this identity as neurodivergence with family members. And yeah, like I have this very public platform. I didn't even think about it when I started the podcast that I was really outing myself in this way. It was just such this like selfish endeavor for me. And I didn't think about how I would be received. And so I'm sort of like, I have this very public persona now as somebody with ADHD, but I don't talk about it at all with my family members. They know that I have it and this podcast exists, but it's something that has been very difficult to talk about in intimate ways. Speaking of, going back to the idea of language too, I love how you sort of play with the idea of mental health, it lost in translation, right? That there are different words in different languages, and that sometimes certain languages can be limited when we're even talking about mental health. Is that something that, is that something that exists in other areas, I guess? I'm not sure what I'm asking. I just love that part of that you explore that in your comics too.
Yeah. So I think like, specifically, I think maybe what you're referencing is like the translation or the term for ADHD in Chinese. And in a way, I feel like there's a lot of parallels between how I think we all feel like ADHD is a terrible name, right? For the condition. Because like, first of all, it's not really an attention deficit. And also like the hyperactivity like component is like, physical hyperactivity is like what we all associate with that term. So it's sort of like, just sweeps a lot of other like expressions of ADHD under the rug. And in Chinese, the term for ADHD is 多动症. So 多 is like a lot, and 动 is to move. So I think like in terms of the Chinese name for ADHD, it's literally you just move too much, right? Which is like even more, I think, like if that's not how your ADHD expresses itself, then yeah, then it's like, then you don't have it, and it's just like you're making excuses or whatnot. And so I think like that is definitely a part of it. And I think like just in general too, it's sort of like the words we use carry a lot of power. And I guess I'm moving a little bit away from like language, but I think like this, just coming back to also, you had asked earlier what kind of inspired the comics. And I think like there was a lot of self-talk in both English and Chinese. I like sort of talked to myself in both in my head, that just like was very caustic. It's like you would never, you know, say things to your friend like, you know, like what the, like I don't know if you like swear on your podcast, but like, you know, what the frick is wrong with you? Like you're so lazy and miserable, and you know, and like you're not tired, like you're just making excuses, blah blah blah. And so actually like so for my webcomic, it's called Panda Cup Stories, and it started out with 3 characters. It was like a cartoon version of me, this like super goofy panda cub, and then the panda's sidekick, like this little hedgie. And like in the beginning, all 3 characters sort of acted exactly the same. And as I was developing the character, like the personalities started to split. And what I realized was that, you know, the hedgehog character takes on a lot of sort of like the inner anxious dialogue or personality that makes up, you know, part of me. And then the panda is very like goofy and impulsive, and the more like physically hyperactive manifestation of me. And what's fun with comics is like, you know, even the mental hyperactivity can be on paper, like physical, like slapdashery. And then I am more the, you know, narrator. And especially when I like write about mental health and I have my characters kind of like helping me tell the story, it's so much easier for me to be kind to myself. Cause like, you know, like who would cuss out a panda, right? And so, yeah, so it's like, it's so much easier to sort of like, also like look back at myself and be like, okay, like, you know, that's probably not what you wanted to do, but you make mistakes. Like a panda can make a mistake. Like it's still, at the end of the day, a part of you that you love, or a part of me that I love. And yeah, like, and it's helped a lot in terms of like cutting back on that negative and really destructive self, like mental chatter that I used to just like do, but not even realize I was doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is so sweet. And I think, you know, the idea of like, okay, I get where all of this negative self-talk is coming from, because we have this, you know, it's going back to that idea of like trying so hard to do the right thing and always feeling like you're missing the mark somehow. And so how we sort of internalize that scolding at ourselves. And I've often talked about like how there's like the adult version of my brain and the child version of my brain. And I partition my conversations into that so that I can be more loving to that resistant side of myself. But I love how you place it in these like characters. But it's the same idea, right? Which is like, how can I internalize that kindness? And, you know, and it reminded me that you've talked about CBT too, that cognitive behavioral therapy has been super helpful in your journey, right? It reminds me a lot of that, of like, what is real in this moment? And, you know, whose voice is this right now? And a lot of those kind of conscious questioning. Now, one thing we haven't talked about, actually, before we get to the cooking, because I have a lot of questions about cooking, but I also just kind of wanted to backtrack a little bit about, you had mentioned when you were a child that you were kind of, you were, you know, that you, what were you saying? You were saying you were just like, there was a lot of that kind of busy brain feeling, and that, but what are some of the things after your diagnosis that you looked back on in your life where you said like the signs were there all along?
Yeah. So, I think like one of the things that I've been thinking a lot is, I have a lot I guess like I used to call it stage fright, I guess, in my mind, but I think like now looking back, it was a lot of like overstimulation and paralysis. So this, especially like, I think when I think back, like I used to play piano competitively, like very stereotypical Asian Asian kid in piano lessons for like 18 years, not 18, like 13 years. But there would be this thing where I would, like practice until my fingers were sore, and like I knew I had these pieces memorized. But then like often when I showed up to like competition, I would get into the middle of the piece, and either like, just looking back now, it's either like the feeling of my finger on the keys, like like the piano was like a little different from my piano at home, maybe like the chair was like different, the feeling, and then I would just get like really pulled into sort of that moment, and I would stumble, and then I would just like freeze. So there would be like some competitions where it's like I played this piece like hundreds of times, and then I just like, I stopped in the middle and lost my spot. And, obviously that does not bode well for competition. And then, and also like looking back to, so I was very, I think like good at performing or like doing academic things where I was able to like prep beforehand, and if I had notes to keep me on track. But I really like struggled with things like extemporaneous speaking or interviews. So especially like when I would be interviewing for like these scholarships for colleges, right? Or like even going into college admission interviews, like if I was asked a question that I didn't prep for beforehand, it's like my mind would like latch on to 30 different potential answers, and then I would like kind of freeze and either like stumble, or I would just like pick the thing my mind latched onto like immediately, which was probably not the best answer, and then like I would go home and be like, God damn it, like why did I say that? Like there was this other thing that would have fit like so much better, but it's like in that moment it's like that thing didn't even exist, like, like out of sight, out of mind. And I think like kind of like now I'm like, oh, like I wish I had known that back then, because then I wouldn't have just like thought I was, just like a terrible person at doing interviews. Or I think like even at one point it's like, maybe my achievements like weren't actually achievements, because if it had truly been important enough to me, or if I had truly been good at it, I would have been able to remember it on the spot. And I think like for me, I have a lot of, I think, compassion for the younger version of myself who was very ambitious and wanted to succeed and just couldn't figure out why I was getting in my own way. So I think like that. And then so I remember, so I do listen to your podcast, but actually when you reached out to interview me, I was like, oh my gosh, I never reviewed her podcast, because I kept meaning to, and then I didn't. So then I reviewed your podcast. I hope it's up now. But I just remember like you mentioning in several episodes where like for you, doing research for a project was never the problem. It was actually sitting down and getting started. And that was just so me. Like I would spend hours and hours like going down every conceivable rabbit hole, but it's like the more work I did, the more difficult it was sometimes to like finally sit down and like write that essay. Or, in a work context, it would be like, I just needed to answer the simple email, but it would take me like the entire day, because I was like, well, I need to look on this, or I need to check up on this. And then like, I just wouldn't write it until I was like, oh, I really, really need to respond to this email. So probably those two things. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. The example of the piano recital was so relatable. It just brought me back to that feeling of sitting down next to, when I was doing my recitals as well, like sitting down on a foreign piano and just having to deal with like all of the differences and getting totally lost in that. Yeah. It was so relatable. But I think, it's interesting when you're talking about these sort of the ways in which suddenly we have this moment where neurodivergency, because now through a lens of ADHD, I'm like, oh, okay, I understand why all of that happened. I have a language for that, right? And how I love how writers like, are experts like Ned Hallowell, and I think even Russell Barkley, who wrote Fast Minds, talks about like reframing, right? And how for everything that we see as a deficiency, there's always the flip side, which is like, another scenario in which this might actually be a tremendous strength, right? And to kind of always think about that. And I think you've talked about this too, how one thing that really was, I guess, not transformative, that seems huge, but a way of thinking for you around ADHD that has been really helpful was like reframing it, neurodivergency as from being a deficiency to being a strength.
Yes.
And seeing that, and I think that's been so helpful for me too, like seeing all of these moments, going back and looking at them and realizing why it was happening, but also like, realizing that same impulse, that same instinct, that same reason, the reason why that was happening in that moment ended up being a strength in another scenario. But yeah. Okay. So, wow. I know the stuck on input thing with research was a huge thing for me. I always sort of thought that I had this undiagnosed learning disorder because of that whole issue. And then I remember seeing it in my daughter and just being like, what is that about? Like, what is this about? Right. Yeah. But yeah, especially that idea of being in an interview and like having all of these ideas come to you all at once and just being like, just pick something.
Yeah.
But this idea that it's like, I always used to say like, it's possible to know too much about something because, I get caught up in like all of the different points of view and all of, well, maybe I have to start at the beginning. And my husband always jokes that he's like, anytime he asks me anything, I like have to start with like, well, I was born on a rainy night. Yep. I'm like,
exactly.
Like you need all the context. So cooking, oh my goodness. I really love your perspective on kind of food and cooking, especially from a neurodivergent point of view. And cooking is something that is so difficult for us, a lot of us. And I think there's, when we talk about like, there's a lot of baggage around cooking, from following recipes to, as I know you've addressed, even just like cooking for one, right? And how like cooking as a form of self-care can be a real problem for us. And I often, I remember if I'm not cooking for my family, my dinner is usually peanut butter out of a jar, right? And so I love that you had made these connections for yourself around cooking and motivation. Right. And this idea that like, it's easier to cook for other people than it is for ourselves because we've externalized that motivation. And I feel like that's something I love to talk about, right? Which is like, how can I connect to my motivation whenever I am struggling with a task, and if the motivation isn't there, how can I invent it, or how can I, create something for me? So now you also had this kind of epiphany around cooking during the pandemic and the lockdown, right? So you moved to New York in 2019, correct?
Yes.
So how long?
The very end of 2019.
I was going to say, like, how long were you actually in the city before the insane times started?
For probably 3 months or so.
Oh my goodness.
I would say, yeah. So I remember like going, the very last like public event I went to was this artist I follow had like launched a book. So I went to her talk and I was like, isn't it cool to be living in a city where I can just like go see my favorite artist whenever I want? And like 2.5 years of just like isolating later, I'm like, okay, things are finally opening up again. Yeah.
Yeah, oh my goodness, what a time, what a crazy time. So you moved to the city and you were sort of launching your own career as an artist, correct?
Yeah.
And then the pandemic happened and you were sort of had this epiphany. So talk me through this epiphany that you had around cooking during lockdown.
Yeah. So this is also me like maybe providing a little bit too much context. So I actually I moved to the city with my previous partner. We had been together for a long time, and one of the main reasons also I spent like such a big chunk of my 20s not cooking was like he loved cooking, and he would like do all of the cooking, and I would like do the dishes, or like sometimes I would like chop stuff for him, but like again, like there was never really a reason for me to like take it upon myself. And the only times I would cook in like back when he and I were together was like when I was like really craving a dish from like my background. So I'm Sichuanese. I was born in Chengdu, and I like that's still my all-time favorite food. And sometimes like that was also a point of like contest where he was like, we don't have to eat Chinese food all the time, and I was like, but we don't. We eat like everything else under the sun. And so. But it would always be like I would make this whole production of it and, you know, like call my mom for the recipe. And then like we would fight because like not fight, but like she would never know the exact measurements because she was like, it's just like I never measure. I just like put however much like I feel is right, which is very not helpful as a neurodivergent cook. Because like, yeah. And so like prior to starting my own kind of like cooking journey, like I would cook like once and then go 3 months without cooking, and then like everything, like you said, like if he was away I would, you know, do takeout, or I would eat like cold cereal for dinner. And so we separated during the pandemic, and in like early 2020 I moved into my own place. I was living alone by myself for the first time in like half a decade, and I was like faced with the prospect of, you know, rebuilding my kitchen from scratch, because like all the stuff was his. And kind of what I found was without, you know, like a kitchen already set up, I just like, it was so hard for me to do anything except for eat frozen meals or do ramen, or, you know, just like default to like cereal without milk because I forgot to like buy milk. And all of that sort of happened within the context of also like lockdown, quarantining by myself. And then especially in New York, there seemed to be just this rising like wave of anti-Asian sentiment. And so that also like made me just like miss my family a lot. And I couldn't go home because of COVID, and my parents are high risk. They're much older than a lot of my like peers' parents. And like for me, it was, I think that was kind of what pushed like the button in my brain to be like, you know, I miss my family, and a big part of it is like we connect to each other and we show love and affection with each other through food. And I was like, well, I have all this time on my hand. I really want to like make a go of this. And so I think like really kind of what started this process was me making that decision, and then at that time me also being a couple years into my ADHD diagnosis, and then like realizing that I was like, oh, like now that I'm hyper focused on this and I have like my core reason why I want to do it, I've always actually been really good at creating like systems and structures. So like I basically set aside a chunk of time to make this something that I pursued like daily. And by that time I had also like started my webcomic. So I was like documenting my process via my comics, and it kind of like snowballed into this like more than just me project, because a lot of my readers like were interested. And so they'd be like asking questions. And then I realized that like I actually learn really effectively if I'm trying to teach someone else as well. And so that is kind of like what prompted my whole journey. And I think I've kind of lost my train of thought. I forgot your original question, but like that's kind of how I started. And then I think like so I basically did this like whole like 3-month journey where I was teaching myself, and then like 15 of my readers had signed on to be like my beta students, and I was like teaching them how to cook Sichuanese, and we did like everything from scratch, right? So like we set up our kitchen. I was like, this is what I'm ordering, you know, this is how we season a wok, these are the core ingredients that we get, and then we cook like 5 dishes together. And it was just like this wonderfully fabulous like fun experience. But then that ended, and then like for a month and a half, I just like reverted to all of my old ways. Like I was trying to build up this business, and then I wasn't cooking for myself. I was just like eating takeout, and I was like, what the fuck is wrong with me? Right? And I was like, was it just a lie? Like, and so I think like that was like my second like epiphany, where I was like, okay, like I kind of started this whole thing, because for me, like, food was about more than just like nourishing myself and satisfying cravings. Like, it's just, for me, is such a core part of connecting with others, whether or not it's like my family or or with my followers or my friends. And so that was when I added kind of like the second element to my cooking program, which is this like monthly recurring like live cook along that I do with my students. And that like kind of created another system where I was like, so this is a reason, and there's a date associated with it where like I explore a new recipe from, you know, my family's like repertoire. And it's actually like just really fun and exciting to be going on this journey with other people, like even if it's virtual. And sometimes, you know, like I have friends join me in person for it. And so I think like for me, that's kind of what I realized. I was like, for me, I needed to kind of like learn how to feed myself consistently and be okay with like, I'm not going to cook myself a gourmet meal from scratch every day, especially if I'm living by myself. Like, sometimes that's just not what I want or what I need. And sometimes I have very low executive function days. And like, then I just have some throw together meals that I do. And then it's like, but then that frees me to actually like spend maybe like several days out of the week, or maybe one day out of the week, like making cooking a really joyful part of my life. And I guess like to wrap up really quickly, it's interesting because like now that I've been working my kitchen muscles a little bit more, some of the like dishes that used to be things I had to like spend a lot of like mental energy on have now become the easier meals that I can just like do. And so it was interesting because I was just talking to, I'm collaborating with a vegan Chinese chef soon on a recipe card. And she was like, yeah, like, so for her, like she is like a, you know, bona fide, like trained culinary chef. Like she went to, you know, like China, like for like culinary school. And then she was like one of the top like dim sum chefs at a very, very famous like dim sum restaurant. And she was like, but I used to just like hate cooking, but now it's like just the water I breathe, that sometimes I forget how hard it was to get started. And I think like that's really what I try and keep in mind, like in my own journey as well. Like I still consider myself like much closer to the beginner than, you know, than she is. And I don't think I really aspire to get to her level, but I think like what I really love is, yeah, just kind of like leading people through the journey that I went on, that like, if you ever, you know, feel this dichotomy of loving food and loving eating with other people and having it bring joy in your life, but then the thought of making it with your own two hands just like makes your skin crawl, then maybe, you know, we can work on that in some way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so great. You know, I always say like the best way to learn about something is to commit to teaching it to somebody else. And exactly. I think maybe that's why so many of us are like entrepreneurial in that way, where it's like, I want to learn about this new thing, so I'm going to create a business in which I have to tell people about it.
Exactly. Yeah. And your podcast as well. I was like, ooh, it's the perfect passion project. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And, you know, and it's funny because the podcast even started as like it's just a lark for me. Like I just was like, I want to talk to other women. How can I do that? And what's a great way to do that? I know, I'll build an entire platform and like make it official so that I have a reason to reach out to people. Yeah. And then it just kind of snowballed from there. And then also that, not only that, but like the idea of connection and community too, I think runs through so much of what I like to call the quote unquote treatment plan with ADHD. Yes. And right, finding each other and learning this language together. And, you know, so much of what you were talking about was recognizing like taking a lot of the shame out of certain things when they behaviors, right, around where they stop working. So it's like I was doing all this stuff and I had become, so accomplished, and then it all just fell apart. Yeah. And rather than being like, what's wrong with me? I should be able to do this, recognizing like, oh, that's interesting. Why did that fall apart? Like thinking of these systems and structures as like, oh, what stopped working? Like, how can I kind of tweak that? And taking a more like, I always feel like it's so helpful to take a more like anthropological look at the situation than it is to say like, I should be doing this consistently, right? Where I'm like, consistency is not your strong point. So let's stop trying to be consistent and start like seeing the strengths and the wonder in not being consistent, right? Like, where can I recognize that? And that a lot of that reframing too. So, oh my goodness. Yeah, it's so wonderful. So so with Panda Cup Diner, you're teaching, you're doing like you have a monthly group? Or how can people sign up for this?
So basically the program is kind of like dual tracked. So like to sort of summarize like what I think the big aha moment for me was, it's like we in general, like neurodivergent or not, like we don't actually need any more information. There's so much information out there at our fingertips, right? Like everything I teach, like you can gather it yourself, like through blogs and YouTube, and you can buy books. But I think like what I found that I really saw it and what my students are really seeking is like one, more structure and clarity, and two, like more connection. So for Panda Cup Diner, the structure and clarity comes from this like online e-course that I put together. So it's like a 30 video, like do it yourself, like checklist process to, if you really want to make like Chinese and Sichuan cooking a part of your life, like this is the roadmap that you take, right? So it's like everyone can like learn by themselves how to bake a cake, but it's like so much more effective if you list out the exact ingredients and the tools and like step 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so like that is sort of the, hop in and do it at your own pace part of the program, which I built first. And then the second part is this kind of like monthly container where it's the more like social body doubling part of the program, where it's like I introduce the recipe in the beginning of the month and I draw like this recipe card. And then I like open up signups. So for people who join the diner, and right now I'm doing just like a lifetime membership enrollment, they get access to all of those monthly classes for free. And so I send like strategically timed emails throughout the month to be like, here's the story behind the dish. Here are the ingredients that we need. And then if people sign up, then they get like a 3 email series of here's the shopping list with links. So just like click, add to your cart, and then buy. Yeah. And then, cause like for me, I'm like, even if you tell me what to buy, I'm like, okay. And then I just never go to the grocery store. And so like, what I really try is to like do as much of the heavy lifting as possible. I think at some point I would love to just like offer a click and buy, like a meal kit box, like Blue Apron. My business is just not at that point, but like, I hope I can get to that point at some time. And then I like, when the weekend comes, like we all log on and we prep together, so you don't have to like, do any prep beforehand or feel like you're behind. And then like we cook together, and usually at the end of the meal, we either just like eat and chat, or similar to you, like I invite someone that like I just really want to talk to or learn more about, who's in the like Asian culinary space, and they sort of like log on as a VIP guest and we all like chat together. So that has really become some of like my most favorite parts of the program. And sneakily, because like ADHDers love to multitask, like these videos are also like the new recipe videos that I then add to the course library, to the like do-it-yourself course library that people can just like access. If people want to like learn more about it, I have a link to that program on my Instagram bio. So Instagram is pandacupstories.com. And then I also have my website, pandacupstories.com. pandacubdiner.com, where basically you can sign up for like a free recorded webinar that I do. That's sort of like is one part Sichuanese 101, here's some basic recipes, and then one part like neurodivergent ADHD friendly cooking strategies that I offer. And so that class is completely free, but it's like if, you know, people like what I do, then they have an option to join my paid program at the end.
This is so incredible. What an incredible resource, right? It's like a virtual dinner party, right?
Yeah.
I feel like it covers so many, it checks so many boxes. I'm just like, it's so exciting. Oh my goodness. I love that. And I just love the story behind sort of how it came to be and all of this beautiful, you know, another wonderful thing about ADHD is having that kind of patchwork quilt of background of like, I'm a children's, you know, I'm just like, I worked with children. I have the illustration element, like all of this kind of comes together in these beautiful, organic ways that I think are so fantastic.
Yeah, totally. I love talking to ADHDers because like, I feel like they're just also multi-passionate, and it's sort of like, yeah, and like you said, it's like embracing the, you know, like, we're so scattered, why can't we pick one career track and focus? And then like, I think there's a reason so many of us like end up being artists and entrepreneurs, because like we're looking for a way to like create our own path, right? Like with the like palette that we've gathered.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Okay, so before I let you go, would you call ADHD something else if you could?
Ooh, yeah, I was thinking about this question. So I didn't actually end up like
I was going to say
a name.
I have that problem, which is like I have too much information. I have no idea what I would call it. So I love asking other people because I'm crowdsourcing.
So kind
no
of
pressure.
like, so I sort of like too. I was like, it's like, you know, Magneto, the X-Man, but like for ideas instead of like, I guess like metal. And then like an idea magnet. And then my other idea was like, you know, an idea whisperer, but in training. And this is very much from, I don't know if you read much of Elizabeth Gilbert's work, but she has this book called Big Magic, which is like my favorite kind of like creative self-help book, I guess is what the bookstore would categorize it under. But I love, so I guess like as a bonus book recommendation, like I love how she thinks about how ideas come to artists. And she was like, she believes that ideas are like little things with souls just like flying around, and, you know, and they'll visit an artist, and, you know, and if you sign a contract with that idea, then you get to bring it into being. And I really feel like for ADHDers, it's like ideas visit you more because you're just like more open and more receptive to them. And yeah, and for me, like my mind is like, they're like butterflies, and it's like you're constantly surrounded by butterflies, and, you know, if you try and like just like grab handfuls of them, like obviously that's like, that's not great, and they're gonna run away from you. But like if you just sort of like, you know, let them come calmly, like maybe one of them will come and like land on your hand, and then that will be the idea that you like create a bond with. So that was not a very concise answer to your question.
Well, no, but, I'm laughing because you're clearly such a visual metaphor person, right?
Yeah.
So I'm like, so it's like, you know, it's like, if you wanted to rename something, immediately it comes to mind are like
the picture,
right? Or just like an archetype of, you know, and it's funny because I've actually I know Big Magic is it's really highly recommended. And I feel like it's been recommended to me so many times over the years, and I really should listen to it. But it's funny because the only book of Elizabeth Gilbert's I've ever read is fiction. It's the Moss researcher book, which I remember The Signature of All Things. That's what it was called.
Yeah.
And it's so good. It's one of my favorite. It's probably high up there in terms of favorites. It's really great. But I'm like, it's so funny because I always hear her referenced and recommended as like a self-help person. And I'm like, I only ever read her fiction.
Yeah.
But yeah, right. That is so, I love all of the visual stuff too. I'm like gnats and tornadoes and buzzers and sparkles and all of it. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I was so excited to pick your brain, and I really appreciate you sharing. I just think you're doing such amazing things in this world, and I love I love your comics so much. I'm like having such a
Thank
fangirl
you.
moment. I love your comics so much. And yeah, so I'll make sure to have all those links in the show notes because I really want, I think the idea of this sort of coming together and being accountable to each other and to our community, I think is such a wonderful way to sort of get the best out of each other and ourselves and grow and all of that. I think it's so lovely. So thank you so much for sitting down with me.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. This is wonderful. I'm very excited to be able to talk to you as well because like you're the voice like in my headphones often, like especially when I'm like tidying or something.
Right? I know.
Yeah.
I'm always like, you should be out walking your dog or something right now listening to me. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you, Linda.
Yeah, likewise.